Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on addressing underperforming businesses in China. I'm Bob Oberles, co-chair of Fredrikson and Byron's China Practice Group. My co-speaker today is Jay Honig. Jay is a director of East-West Consulting, former GM of Bechtel, and chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. I'll turn it over to Jay to get us started shortly and allow him to introduce his background further. I'll just say a few comments about today's topic. I think the topic is of importance to many companies, partly because of the recent slowdown in China's economy. Many companies, many of our clients are making adjustments to strategy to ensure that they can be profitable in the short and long term in an environment with potentially higher costs, less robust growth, and tougher competition. Often this means taking a hard look at elements of their business that are underperforming and making appropriate adjustments. So what we've focused on for today's presentation is turnarounds, restructurings, reductions in force, and voluntary liquidations. Jay will cover these issues from the operational perspective. I'll cover them from the legal perspective. And if we have time at the end, we'll answer a few questions that we received during the course of the presentation. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Jay Honig to get us started.
Great, thank you, Bob. Let me add my welcome as well. We've got an awful lot of material to cover. I understand that most of you have a copy of the presentation already, so I may go through these slides fairly quickly. And then we can focus possibly on the Q&A side on specific questions that you may have. Just a comment about East-West. For those of you who are not familiar with East-West Associates, we've been in business for over 8 years. We focus primarily on supporting foreign companies, mainly U.S., small, medium-sized companies, on dealing with operational, commercial, and risk management issues in China. Most of our senior staff, or all of our senior staff, have lived and worked in China for well over 15 years and have had P&L responsibilities for running operations. So with that, let me sort of jump into this. We're going to talk a little bit about the new normal. I think Bob alluded to that in his opening comments. What are the implications of the new normal on how to do business? Talk about some turnaround and restructuring techniques, and then look specifically at what I would call street level recommendations on how to deal with a major downsizing and a plant closure. As Bob mentioned, the environment is changing. There's some pluses and minuses with that. Obviously, the middle class is expanding. We're seeing traction in the Go West expansion, which is expanding the domestic market and so forth. But in the main, if you look at what's happening, the slowdown is not necessarily a global slowdown or only a global slowdown, but it's a slowdown in China as well. Consumer spending is not taking off as much as the government would like, and there's obviously significant policy issues associated with that. There is a sense of rising protectionism with some legislation that's coming out. The growing sense of labor activism, if not directly supported, certainly inferred supported by the state, and you're starting to see new labor laws come out that are reinforcing labor activism. And of course, then there's the 100,000-foot level issue that major companies are concerned about some of the tensions in the South China Sea. We talk about labor. The demographics are changing. The size of the workforce is going to continue to shrink. there's going to be fewer young workers and a lot more factories. And these young workers are not like their parents. These are reform era children, and they're exposed to mass media. They're more demanding. They know what their rights are, and they're not going to go back to the farm. So we're dealing with a whole different labor force than we did when companies moved to China 15, 20 years ago. So what does that mean? That means what we're hearing from our clients is, when times were good, profitability was good, margin was really solid, but now that the markets seem to be shrinking, we're losing profitability, and those companies who were marginally profitable in good times now are really having difficulties even staying in the black. And some of the old approaches to running businesses in China, the fly in, fly out management, everything's fine. We're making good enough products, we've got a good margin pressure. And companies, our clients, are coming to us and sort of scratching their head and said, why is this happening, and how can we address it? Recent AmJam survey, and I apologize, this is a 2015 survey, that as most of you know, and I think most of the people on the webinar have operations in China, one size doesn't fit all. The service sectors are doing quite well. Retail, particularly luxury goods and so forth, still fairly relatively strong. Automotive, but manufacturing seems to have been hit significantly. Some of that can be attributed to the lack of funding by the government, and you're seeing manufacturers of off-road equipment, and all of the supply chain associated with that is really hurting the manufacturing industries. And late last year, about 20% of companies said they're looking at layoffs, which is highly unusual in China. So what does that mean? That means companies are having to reassess their overall operations, and whether it's looking for cost reductions or consolidating operations and so forth, they're not quite sure how to do this. The large multinationals that have the infrastructure in China obviously can put resources on these types of investigations, but small, medium-sized companies just don't have the expertise to do that. So we've put together, based on our experience with assisting small, medium-sized companies, a set of techniques, and it's pretty basic. It's something that you could, quite frankly, apply to most parts of the world, with obviously a bent towards the Chinese environment. Operational assessment is key. Do you have the right leadership in place? And are the roles and responsibilities aligned with the levels of authority? Do you fly in? Do you fly out? Do you have a full leadership team that is capable of addressing not only how to operate in boom times, but do they have the experience to deal with a downturn and making the tough decisions, such as reduction in force and cost cutting and so forth like that during stressful times? Sales and marketing, I guess if there's one area that we get calls on immediately, and that is our sales revenue is dropping, and we don't know why. We've got the same workforce and so forth and so on. So one of the key components that we offer and suggest is to do a voice of the customer. Go out, talk to customers, and find out what do they think about the company, the management, the leadership, the products, the cost of the products, and so forth and so on. And that can be very revealing, not only for the U.S. side, the headquarters side, but also the local team as well. Looking back, many of our clients have been either pushed by the board or pulled by large OEMs. Classic example, obviously, would be automotive. And that's where they established their China operations. And they've relied on a small handful of large OEMs to drive their China business. Well, many of these OEMs have localized their supply chain, and many have lost these contracts, and that puts them in a predicament as to where are we going to find new markets. So diversifying their client base is generally key. Obviously, looking at cost reductions and automation enhancements and things like that come into play when you're looking at process improvement. Another area we focus on is rationalizing the supply chain and making sure that you're keeping up to date with latest competitive pricing for your raw materials and so forth. Reductions in force, again, the cost reduction, does your management, whether it's local management, whether it's international management, expat management, do they have experience on how to deal with cost reduction and the issues that arise when you have a major layoff or you have shift reductions, cutting overhead, and so forth and so on. Expat packages can be a big burden on small, medium-sized companies, and one has to ask the question, are they appropriate at this point in time? Restructuring, again, consolidation of physical assets and plants, or for that matter, the selling and closing of unprofitable, not necessarily facilities, but business lines and products to reassess whether or not these are viable products that the company is offering. Lastly, there is the closing and even divestiture of assets in China, moving elsewhere. We don't see much of that. Some go to Southeast Asia, but primarily most of our clients are wanting to produce in China for China. So leaving the country is not necessarily an option, but weathering this storm is going to force them to make some tough decisions. With that, let me jump into the closure situation. And if I can preface this by saying this is sort of a street level operational view of closing a facility. It's a complex task, which includes legal compliance, tax, labor, accounting, as well as the operational side. So I'm just going to offer some suggestions based on our experience, and I have to say that personally, I've been involved in, I'd say, 50 some odd closures or large major downsizing of facilities. Much of this came about in the global downturn in 09 and 2010, and we've seen experiences with closures, sometimes not having to do with the business at all. It could be urban renewal, forcing the companies to move outside of center city operations and so forth. But what we saw early on in 2010 was unethical behavior on many types of foreign companies. I'm not going to say that they apply necessarily to U.S. companies, but an awful lot of young workers were locked out and lost months and months of salaries and benefits and so forth. They were basically, in my view, exploited during that downturn. And they have long memories, and they also have social media. So every time there's an implication that maybe a new plant or a plant is going to close, it's going to be relocated, even if there's a new owner coming in, the social media will become alive with, well, what's going to happen now? There was an inexperience, in my view. Times were good. They were always good. People were expanding. They weren't closing. So how to close a factory, really, there wasn't a whole lot of experience. And at the same time, there's always unrealistic employee expectations on severance packages and so forth. We heard many times from corporate headquarters in New York and Chicago, well, just let's make sure we have the law enforcement and we've got the legal structure and so forth and so on. Well, when you have a strike at the gate, it's a little late to be figuring out what to do. So our experience, and we've seen just about every kind of tactic that can be used, and there are similar tactics in similar parts of the country. It can be sit-ins, it can be lock-ins and lockouts, it can be headquarters disruptions in downtown Shanghai at the Plaza 66 or the various high-end office complexes where workers will go and disrupt the offices. It can be sabotage, and we've seen, and I'm sure everyone's heard of the kidnappings and holding general managers hostage and so forth and so on. Our view on a closure is pretty fundamental, and that is you have to secure the facility first. You have to make sure that your people are protected, your assets and your information are protected, and you need a closure plan. Again, if you have a militant group that's not allowing you to close the plant, possibly sabotaging equipment and what have you, all of this is going to take an awful lot of management time to try to figure out what to do on the fly, and that generally doesn't work. Our experience is that companies that plan well in advance and have a thorough aligned plan are the companies that typically these closures go fairly smoothly. So our recommendations would be work with somebody who has really rich experience in dealing with different types of closures. Form a multifunctional team, and that means someone from headquarters, management, local HR, local legal, either in-house or outside counsel, operations, and make sure that you really understand all of the stakeholders that are going to be impacted by this. Not only employees, it could be local governments, development zone officials, it could be obviously suppliers. If you have a sole source, single source supplier, when you close your plant, they're going to have some issues with that. Also, obviously, your customers and how you're going to continue to serve your customers. So having an aligned plan up front, and this takes more than a week to plan out. We've had companies start this process as much as 6 months in advance. Obviously, follow the labor laws, and I know Bob will get into that a little bit. The demographics this is the area I think that is probably the most important, and that is understanding the demographics of your workforce. We've had HR managers say, well, we have loyal workforce. Well, when you lay them off, they're not going to be loyal anymore. But did you buy this, invest in this company, this maybe an SOE, then a joint venture, and now it's a woofie? And looking back, what sort of labor history was there? Was there unrest? The militancy, did that arise in future or in past transitions? In some cases, obviously, you look at the demographics of the employees themselves. Are these 50-year-old machinists, or are they mostly younger migrant workers? Again, the demographics may give you an indication as to the level of unrest that you might be able to anticipate. And then understand what the local compensation package is, not what the labor law says. Labor law N+1, that doesn't work. If the local factories around there that have closed or downsized are paying N+2 or N+3. If you've already closed another facility and the agreement was, which could be confidential, may not be confidential, that you paid N+3 or N+4, you're not going to be able to get away with N+1 or N+2 with another shutdown. So the precedents have been set. I think strong consideration really needs to be given to who's going to make the announcement. Make sure that person is well respected. Typically, a senior, a Chinese employee, manager, or executive. But also make sure that you have an exit strategy in case things tend to go south. And then make sure that you're in your comments of who, what, when, where, that you don't say, we're thinking about the severance package and we'll get back to you. That typically is a red flag, and a small percentage of people can rile up the organization, and we've seen them rush the stage and try to hold the people hostage and so forth and so on. Do not make the announcement in your factory or your facility or your office building. Police will not respond. It would be considered a private commercial dispute, and they will not enter the property unless there is physical violence or injury, and that threshold is very, very high. Even at that, sometimes the PSB will not intervene. So make sure that you do it in a development zone building, a conference room, or auditorium, or even a large hotel. We've done an awful lot of these announcements in, say, 2-3-star hotels that are in the local area. Know how much guanxi you have with the local PSB and the Labor Bureau and the local government. If you do feel that you have that, then you can recruit their support and keep them up to date. And then, of course, you want to obviously make sure that your plant is locked down, your IT systems are shut down, and so forth and so on. So, in summary, I guess the issue with a shutdown is they're unpredictable. If there is violence, it's typically intense but very short term. It's short term if you have a plan on how to deal with it. If you don't, then that can be a prolonged problem where you're not going to be able to properly decommission the plant and dispose of the assets and so forth. Legal stuff, HR, F&A, it can be done offsite. But management time is going to be totally absorbed in trying to secure the assets and protect the management of the staff. So having a crisis management plan is absolutely key. At the end of the day, it's about face and it's about money. You're dealing with migrant workers. That's a little bit different than dealing with local residents, although it shouldn't be. But it's a matter of you as a company deciding how you can both respect your employees, yet make sure that you're paying the proper amount of severance pay, not only according to the law, but what is local practice and what they deserve. And then I'd add a little to that. And that typically will dampen any unrest that may arise. So as far as the overall slowdown is concerned, I think China is changing. The rising middle class, Mrs. Wong is not going to buy good enough products for her family anymore. She wants the best and safe products. Having a presence there alone just isn't going to make you successful. You've got to tailor your products to the marketplace, and you've got to have a management structure both in the U.S. and in China that understands the marketplace and has the flexibility to be nimble and address these issues as they arise. So with that, let me turn it back to Bob, and Bob's going to get into some of the legal aspects of turnarounds and restructuring and closures. Thanks.
Thank you, Jay. Let me just advance to my slide. I'm going to turn now to address, as Jay said, a number of these issues from a different perspective, more of a perspective of PRC law and practice. I will touch on restructurings, reductions in force, liquidations, and a few related issues. Starting with restructurings, there's lots of reasons why our clients need restructure their businesses. In my practice, what we see most often is restructuring in the context of M&A. When we're representing sellers, sometimes we need to restructure the business to get it ready for sale. When we're representing buyers, often we'll restructure the business after the deal is done to consolidate assets and entities into existing businesses. And anytime, following acquisitions of new businesses, we often receive requests to help with consolidating the China legal entities post-closing. And in the U.S., this can sometimes be accomplished quite efficiently from a tax and operational perspective by merger. But in China, mergers are a different story. If the two entities being merged are established in different cities, it can be complicated. As the government authorities in each jurisdiction may have conflicting requirements and may be reluctant to support the merger. So it's often necessary to secure the support from local authorities to ensure that they're going to agree in principle to allow the merger. They're also time-consuming, and like a lot of these transactions in China, they're very document-intensive. We'll need a merger agreement, merger application, company resolutions. We have to amend the Articles of Association. There needs to be a public announcement at the national and the local newspapers. The two different cities will have their own documents that they'll want included in the application. Legally, in terms of a timing perspective, it can take about close to 300 days to effect the merger. And in our experience, they can be accomplished more quickly if execution by the client is prompt and there's no unexpected complications. But generally, given a lot of the complexities, the path we often take when a company is looking to consolidate existing businesses in China is not to go the merger route, but instead we would proceed to deregister the entities that are no longer needed, and then just transfer over any assets or people to the surviving entity prior to deregistration. And even that, it's not great, because the entity that you don't need anymore, we still have to go through a liquidation deregistration process. So it is document intensive and time intensive, but often we don't see much benefit in trying to use the merger statute in accomplishing some of these restructurings. The next, sorry, I went advanced too fast. On spin-offs, spin-offs are also an option if you can find a third-party buyer. Sometimes what we do is, to lower capital gains, we'll occasionally assist the company to apply to reduce the registered capital before selling off the business. This is something to consider. Occasionally, and I think it's in the current environment, a little less common, but we do see companies that will address poor performance by investing in growth, and that often involves recruiting new management and completing add-on acquisitions to complement and support that growth. The majority of the time, though, at least currently, the restructurings means cutting back and sometimes shutting down. And I'll go into this in more detail in a few minutes, but I'll just make a few points on this slide. For small businesses with few employees, we often receive a question of whether the company can put the business on the shelf and make it dormant until the months or years down the road when it's needed again. This generally doesn't work well in China, because all foreign invested enterprises need to go through an annual audit and inspection process and show that it's engaging in business year after year. So it doesn't have to be profitable, it doesn't have to have a lot of activity, but it needs to show some activity. And if it's just dormant and it has no employees, doesn't have an address, it will eventually get shut down. The business license will be revoked. Another common question we get after companies learn of the complexities and the resources involved in shutting down an entity legally is whether they can just walk away from the entity after they've paid off their employees and creditors. And this typically is a request that comes when the company is more or less already insolvent. They don't expect any residual funds to be left over to repatriate. And I think we would typically advise against this path, even if there's no money to repatriate, and instead recommend that the company go through the formal deregistration process. Not just kind of walking away is problematic for a few reasons. One, it can get the parent company and its foreign employees blacklisted in China, so that if they try to open a company again down the road, they could be blocked from doing so. And the foreign employees who are associated with the Chinese subsidiary, they could also be blocked from leaving China. And the authorities would hold them and ask them to answer for company debts. It'd be very rare, but it's certainly possible. It also doesn't work in my experience, because for a lot of companies, you still have this legal entity in the corporate structure that's dormant. And if you ever sell the group company or a division that owns the dormant company, the buyer is likely going to want, when they do their diligence, they're going to want that entity deregistered before closing. And if you can't do that, they're going to, if they look at it closely, they're going to ask for some sort of indemnification or payment to clean it up. And it's for sure going to cost a lot more to clean things up down the road when all the employees have departed, the documents are missing, it's been difficult to find, than had you just shut it down properly to begin with. So walking away is not something that we would typically advise. I would say the most restructuring work that we do comes in the context of a change of control of the parent company as part of an M&A transaction. What we see is that with new management, you get new priorities, and for some, the mandate is to expand and grow and acquire and make China a larger piece of the company's growth story. And for others, the mandate is to restructure and consolidate and reduce and sometimes exit. And many of our clients, when they're acquiring a target business, they have sort of their own ideas about where they can squeeze more productivity out of the China business that's coming along with the acquisition. They might think they have good options to reduce costs and bring them more in line with revenue, or build in synergies with their existing businesses in China. And in my experience, this is an area where the gains can be oversimplified or exaggerated. The legal and regulatory restrictions often limit how fast and how deep you can cut, as I'll talk about in a minute. And as Jay had mentioned, they may also find that their senior managers, that whether they're their own managers or folks who they're inheriting through the deal, the senior managers on the ground, they're often ill-prepared to execute on these kind of deep cuts, and they require far more support and mentoring and training than would be expected. And sometimes you just need to replace them and bring in new management who can be more effective in driving these kinds of changes. So it's always good to keep this in mind if you're contemplating acquisitions and your business plan includes material restructuring of the China business post-closing, to get a little bit of advice or input in terms of how that might work, so that can be factored into sort of budget and business planning. With respect to mass layoffs, a big part of the story when companies are looking to bring costs in line with slower growth are reductions in force, and China has regulations that expressly deal with the process for carrying out layoffs. The law essentially allows companies that encounter, they call severe difficulties in production and operation, that necessitates laying off at least 20 employees or more than 10% of its total employees. If it meets those criteria, it can implement a layoff. The company to go through a statutory layoff process, it has to follow certain prescribed steps. And for one, the company needs to explain the layoff plan and the severance pay to the trade union, if there is one, or the employees, if there isn't a trade union, at least 30 days in advance. And another requirement is that the employer solicit and consider the trade unions or the employees' opinions with respect to the details of the layoff plan. And then once those discussions are done, the employer would report the layoff plan to the local labor bureau. So the statute looks like it's a good process, a good mechanism for carrying out a mass layoff. If you have 1,000 employees and you have to cut 200 of them, just by looking at the statute alone, it looks like there's a good, clear process for doing that. But there's sort of the devil's in the details with the layoff law. And for instance, it requires that the employer report to the local labor bureau. But in practice, this reporting requirement is really more of an approval requirement. So if the local labor bureau is not satisfied with the information that you're communicating, it may delay filing its notice, and their approval and their cooperation or lack of cooperation can be a really significant barrier to implementing the layoff. Another practical reality is that during the process of reporting the layoff plan to authorities, they might have their own opinion as to whether the layoff is necessary or legal. And the practical challenges of complying with their requirements end up substantially delaying the implementation of the layoff. So we often, for a lot of these reasons, our clients, and we often steer many of our clients to other options to the formal mass layoff, just to ensure that kind of certainty. It really depends on the locality, the company's relationship with the local labor bureau, how many layoffs they've been having, what's the local unemployment rate. A lot of factors can play into it. But in recent mass layoffs that we've been handling, often we go through other routes outside of the statutory process. So I'll say a few words about other options. One of the I would say the most common approach is to negotiate mutual termination agreements with each employee. And unlike the statutory layoff process, in this case, each individual employee's consent would be required, and you'd have a written mutual termination agreement executed with each employee. And so obviously this can be a time-consuming process, require a lot of HR resources, much more than a mass statutory layoff where in an ideal case you just submitted the plan to authorities and they gave the approval, and then your 200 or 300 workers will be terminated according to that plan. In this case, you have to reach an agreement with each of the affected employees, and it sounds like a lot of work, but in the end, whether it's 100 employees or 200 employees, our experience is you can get through those fairly quickly. We can do that in a week or two, and often, as with one of Jay's slide, 90–95% of the employees will often take the offer, or just with a little bit of negotiation that you originally provide. And then there's a few outliers that need to be dealt with separately with maybe further higher payments or through other options. But generally, this is the preferred approach, and the recent ones that we've been doing, they're often can be done fairly smoothly, even with very minimal HR resources on the ground. A couple items in terms of controlling costs in this process. Companies often try to pick the labor contracts which are to expire soon. Ideally, if you have a contract that's coming up in a couple months, you wouldn't have to negotiate any termination. You just let that expire. And then the other, when identifying the different employees that would be terminated, often companies will look for the employees whose service time is going to be relatively shorter. It will be very important to take precautions to secure important seals and chops and licenses and certificates that employees who may be terminated might be in possession of, and that's fairly standard procedure, along with controlling IT and email accounts for those affected employees. I would underscore what Jay said about planning. Often companies are coming out with these, might come from headquarters at the board level, and it's a global reduction, and they want this implemented as soon as possible. And the timeline is often incredibly aggressive with respect to China. And I would say for a lot of the most successful reductions in force that I've participated in, usually we have several months to prepare. If you have a couple hundred people who are going to be terminated, it's going to take a lot of time to gather their employment agreements and make sure all comp calculations and the termination agreements, the notices, board resolutions, all of these documents are prepared well in advance, and that the teams that will be negotiating with the employees are very familiar with the severance packages and the handover timelines, and also any backup plan. Another option for employers to use in place of or together with the mutual terminations is unilateral termination. Unilateral termination is available under very limited circumstances, and practically when companies are facing the need to make significant reductions, there's usually only a small handful of employees that are likely to fit within these boxes. For instance, the traditional ways of unilaterally terminating when there's incompetence after training, you put them on a performance improvement plan. Often it's just not realistic to start to put that into place. You can identify certain employees that may have committed serious violations of company policy. Again, trying to marshal the evidence and support for that is not usually very practical. So there are other grounds like these that you want to consider to see whether anybody might fall into them, so that you don't have to go down the route of negotiating mutual termination, and you can maybe lower the amount that you need to pay, but it would typically be a very small handful of folks. That's all I'll say about reductions in force and for now, and then I'll turn to winding down. So sometimes the answer to underperforming businesses, as I mentioned, is not further layoffs or cost cutting, but it's a complete exit or liquidation of the business. And there's two in China right now. There's two main routes to do liquidations, depending on whether the company is solvent. Voluntary liquidation is what we deal with 90% of the time when the company is solvent, and my slides are focused on that. When a company is insolvent, you have special bankruptcy rules, which I won't cover today. I'll just note voluntary bankruptcy is when when an insolvent company files for bankruptcy. Involuntary bankruptcy is when it's insolvent and a creditor or some other third party has pulled the company into bankruptcy. On this slide, we have the steps of a voluntary dissolution process, as you might see in per statute or described in academic books. It emphasizes the typical things you would think of that would be necessary as part of a liquidation. You establish your liquidation committee. There's public announcements. You have to register your creditors. The process for stopping business operation and paying off debts and disposing of assets. So these are all, again, kind of what you would think of, but surprisingly, this group of steps is actually a very small part of the liquidation process. In reality, most of the critical work needs to happen before the company can file a voluntary dissolution application. And this involves the determination of employment contracts and negotiating severance with each of the employees, sorting through logistics of stopping business operation, dealing with warranty service obligations and related issues. In the last months, we've done several liquidations that we've been working on have finished, and the average was around 12 to 14 months, soup to nuts, to get them done, and that's pretty typical. And part of the game, part of the goal is to identify any potential barriers that might slow the process down, and any type of legal action by creditors, by suppliers, distributors, employees. These are all things that can very easily slow the process down by many months. And so it's really important to get this sort of pre-liquidation planning right, so that you have the right package that you're going to be offering employees. You have a plan for dealing with customers and how you're going to handle warranties, and you're thinking through all of the potential claims and trying to come up with kind of equitable solutions for those, so that when you roll this out, there's not a stampede by either employees or customers or other constituents who feel like they're going to be left out and immediately start to take action against the company that complicates the wind down process. When it comes to terminating the employees in a liquidation, there's a lot of similarities to what we discussed when implementing reductions in force. The law provides that dissolution is a statutory ground for unilateral termination. So technically, if you're shutting down the company, you shouldn't have to negotiate with anybody. You're just shutting down the company. This is what the law requires for severance. That's the end of the story. But in practice, it's much better to reach mutual termination with as many employees as you can to avoid disputes. And so paying additional compensation, 1 to 3 months salary, I think would be typical on top of what's legally required severance is common practice. And if you don't do that, you're likely to have the employees get together and they will cause significant delays in terms of working through the Labor Bureau and with them to try to negotiate something. And the net effect of that is it just will draw out your process. In some cases, the company is okay with that, but generally, if it's adding a couple more months of salary to the severance, this is something that they are that's worthwhile to spend, and it helps accelerate the process. Sort of the liquidation process is very similar to setting up a company, where you're going to various government bureaus for their permission, and likewise, when you're shutting down, you're going back to a lot of those same government bureaus and departments to ask their permission to unwind. And the Commerce Bureau is one that the company will need to see, and they will request that the company submit documents to prove that all the employees were duly terminated before granting the approval. And that's where the process where if there's a lot of labor claims because they feel like they weren't paid a statutory requirement or somehow they were not treated fairly, those are things that will draw out the process with the Commerce Bureau. They sometimes also will review the termination contracts to see whether they are, in their view, fair. And as I mentioned before, the considerable time is also needed to terminate all the business contracts with suppliers and customers so that you avoid disputes and legal claims. This is an area that crops up time and again and can be even thornier and more difficult to deal with than employees in a lot of respects for those that feel like they are holding the bag for certain warranty obligations, or that they don't feel like they're going to get support or otherwise, and this is their last opportunity to extract some sort of compensation for what they view as their loss. And so trying to think through who those folks are and how best to approach them and deal with that is really important, and it needs time to do. With that, I will turn to a couple last points. And I think I would just note on the warranty obligations, some of our clients have worked with third parties to deal with the warranty. Basically, finding certain third parties to take over warranty obligations, or if that's not feasible, then just using maybe the parent company will, in certain cases, assume the warranty obligations. So on this last slide, there's just a couple points that I wanted to note. One of the practical realities is as employees learn of a facility that's being liquidated, equipment can start to walk off by itself. And if the equipment is valuable, if you're planning on selling it, then obviously it needs to be secured. If it contains any key technology or know-how, then it needs to be properly secured and destroyed. And it's there's been a few recent cases where there was no liquidation announced, but there were just rumors, and even with the rumors, things started to disappear that were of substantial value, and so this is an obvious point, but it's one that bears emphasis because it's often once people think that the company is being shut down and they may not have the future, you start to lose important people, and it becomes more challenging than anticipated to maintain kind of ordinary security. This is also, we've seen this happen as well with the landlord. If the landlord raises all sorts of concerns, they start to make it difficult in terms of security, sometimes locking people out and making it difficult for you to move equipment and take other precautions. For some of the equipment, it's also important to keep in mind that it can be difficult to export used equipment back to the home country. That's often as you're looking at the equipment, what needs to be sold off and what can come back, we often see that the process of getting out of the country is more troublesome. So if at all possible, to find some sort of local buyer is usually the most efficient way to deal with it. Work permits, with respect to any expats you have, obviously their work permits, their work visas, the residence permits, those will all need to be canceled, and they'll need to make appropriate arrangements, as it'll impact their ability to remain in China unless they can secure a position with another entity within the company or another job. For the repatriation of money, any funds that are left over, those will be returned to the shareholder after the completion of the dissolution process. And in our experience, once you've completed the full dissolution process and you've gotten all the requisite government approvals, we have not had any difficulty with the clients getting any residual money out of the country. So with that, I think we can bring our remarks to a close, and we're almost out of time. I think what we can do is maybe just take a couple questions that we've received, and then we'll wrap things up. So one question for Jay. Jay, you mentioned that you can't anticipate PSB or police support with respect to these shutdowns, and the question is just to explain why that is.
Now, Bob, I think we touched on it a little bit. The PSB generally will view labor disputes with an employer as commercial disputes, and they really don't want to be asked to intervene on one side or the other. They don't know whether the employees are truly being mistreated in some way, and they have a right to picket or challenge the management in some respects. So they tend to stay away. In some cases, we've seen them recruited to participate, and unless they're properly briefed, they can overreact. And in today's environment, where the press is going to be there, potentially be there, and here you have the police rounding up demonstrators or what have you, and it's all being filmed with your logo on the side of the building, hitting the press and so forth. So I think the issue is understand if you are going to notify the PSB, make sure you brief them as to the overall plan, and that you'll call them as necessary, but just alert them to the fact that it's happening. The other issue is one of confidentiality. And of course, the more people you tell a month in advance, the more time some of the more militant employees, if there are militant employees, have time to plan a reaction. So we take a view that we'd rather keep a shutdown as confidential as possible, as long as possible, only informing those government entities that we feel that we can trust that they will hold it in confidence. And again, it depends on whether you're in a large developed professional development zone or you're in a small village zone. You have to look at those situations differently. So we suggest closing at the announcement, allowing people to come back and get their personal property, and then securing the facility. If not, you send them back for a month, and you're gonna see equipment disappear, IP disappear, and so forth.
Good. Okay. Well, I think we're out of time. So with that, we'll bring this to a close, and we'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. Hope you found the webinar useful, and you'll be receiving momentarily a brief survey asking for feedback along with CLE credit to the extent that that's something that you need. And for the survey, it'd be great if you can fill it out. Really important, valuable to us to get the information gathered and improve these presentations in the format. So with that, I think we will we'll end. Thanks again, and have a good afternoon.